The ceramic vase shattered 2 inches from Oren Calloway's face. Nobody moved. Not the butler standing by the gold-trimmed door. Not the 2 security guards flanking the marble staircase. Not the head housekeeper gripping her clipboard so tight her knuckles had gone pale. Nobody in the entire grand ballroom of Draxler Palace moved a single muscle. Because the child had never missed before. Little Cassiel Draxler stood at the center of the room surrounded by white rose petals and broken porcelain. His small chest heaved. His dark eyes burned. And his tiny hands, balled into fists at his sides, trembled with something too old and too heavy for a 4-year-old boy to carry. Oren didn't run. He didn't flinch back. Didn't reach for anything. Didn't call for help he couldn't have called for anyway, because Oren Calloway hadn't spoken a single word in 3 years. He just stayed. Crouched low to the marble floor so his eyes were level with the boy's. Still. Calm. The way a person gets calm when they've already been through the worst thing life can do to them, and they know this, whatever this is, isn't it? Hi viewers. Have you ever met someone, a child, a stranger, anyone, who pushed everyone away, but something made you stay anyway? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know. Cassiel stared at him. 5 seconds. 10. The boy's fist slowly unclenched. And then the child who had made 32 caregivers quit, some in tears, some bleeding, one reportedly still refusing to discuss what happened, walked across the shattered porcelain in his bare feet and pressed his small face directly into Oren's shoulder. The room stopped breathing. Oren lifted his arms and held him. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The chandelier light fell across them both like something from a painting nobody deserved to witness. The head housekeeper, a tall man named Broderick Vance, pressed 2 fingers against his own lips. His eyes were wet. Oren didn't notice any of it. He was thinking about the job posting he'd found 3 days ago, folded inside a damp newspaper at the bus stop near his apartment building. Temporary caregiving position. Palace residence. Competitive daily rate. He'd been working 2 jobs then, early morning dishwashing at a downtown diner and late night stocking at a grocery warehouse. And still coming up short on rent. His coat had a hole in the left pocket. His shoes were a half size too small because the right pair at the thrift store had already been taken. He had applied anyway. Because Oren Calloway had learned a long time ago that the things most people run from are usually the things that need someone the most. The employment coordinator who contacted him had been kind but direct. 32 caregivers in 14 months. The child was volatile. Unpredictable. Physically aggressive in ways that seemed impossible for his size. There were medical opinions, psychological evaluations, specialist consultations, none of them stuck. Most of the staff believed the boy simply refused to be reached. Oren had listened to all of it through the phone pressed against his ear in his tiny apartment, sitting on the edge of his mattress with the window cracked because the heat hadn't worked in 2 weeks. Then Broderick Vance himself had called. Personally. And the first thing he said before the salary or the schedule or the non-disclosure agreement was this. Most caregivers leave bleeding. Oren had signed the paperwork the next morning. Now here he was. Day 1. 20 minutes into his first hour. Holding a child the whole palace had given up on. He felt something wet against his shirt collar, and realized Cassiel was crying. Not the screaming, furniture-throwing kind of crying from 60 seconds ago. The quiet kind. The kind that happens after the fight drains out, and only the tired part stays. The kind Oren recognized because he had cried exactly like that, alone in a hospital room, the night he lost his voice and understood it wasn't coming back. He rubbed slow circles against the boy's back. And across the ballroom, from behind the half-open door that nobody had noticed him standing behind, a man watched. He was tall. Dark-suited. Completely still. His face was unreadable in the way that faces get when the person behind them has spent years making sure nothing shows. Caleb Draxler. The head of the Draxler Empire. The man whose name made rival syndicate bosses check their exits before sitting down to dinner. The man whom 3 city judges had refused to indict because the paperwork kept disappearing. The man who had not smiled, according to Broderick Vance, who had worked in this palace for 11 years. Not once, in the last 14 months. He was staring at Oren. Not with suspicion. Not with the calculated cold assessment he used on business associates and potential threats. With something Broderick Vance, watching from across the room, had never once seen on that man's face. Something close to wonder. Then Cassiel made a small sound against Oren's shoulder. A sigh. Almost peaceful. And Caleb Draxler disappeared behind the door before anyone could confirm he had been there at all. Oren held the boy until the trembling stopped. When Cassiel finally pulled back and looked at him, his dark eyes were dry. Searching. Like he was trying to figure something out that he didn't have words for either. Then the boy reached down, picked up a single fragment of the broken vase from the marble floor, and held it out. An offering. Or an apology. Oren took it gently from his small hand. And somewhere deep in the palace, past the gold corridors and the locked offices and the rooms nobody was allowed to enter, a security monitor flickered. The footage from the ballroom was already being reviewed. By the 3rd day, the palace staff had stopped pretending they weren't watching. They gathered in doorways, hovered near corners, found sudden reasons to polish fixtures that did not need polishing, right outside whatever room Oren and Cassiel happened to be in. Because what was happening between that child and the new caregiver did not follow any pattern they had ever seen, and none of them could look away. Cassiel Draxler, the boy who had bitten 2 nurses and shattered a therapist's laptop, and once screamed for 6 hours without stopping, was sitting cross-legged on the playroom floor quietly handing Oren wooden building blocks. One at a time. Waiting for Oren to place each one before handing over the next. Patient. Deliberate. Like they had agreed on a system nobody else was told about. Oren stacked them slowly. Carefully. He let Cassiel set the pace. Never rushed. Never redirected. When the tower eventually fell, he didn't react with alarm or exaggerated cheerfulness. He just tilted his head at the collapsed pieces, looked at Cassiel, and raised both hands in a small shrug that said exactly, "Well, we'll build another one." Cassiel almost smiled. Almost. Broderick Vance documented it in his daily report, and then sat with the paper in his hands for a long moment before filing it. The nights were harder. Cassiel didn't sleep well. He hadn't since the incident 14 months ago that nobody on staff was willing to describe with any detail. They called it the event. They referred to it in past tense, and then changed the subject. All Oren had gathered from fragments of overheard conversation was that something had happened to Cassiel outside the palace walls, that he had been returned safely, and that he had not been the same boy afterward. When Cassiel woke screaming at 2 in the morning on the 4th night, Oren was already moving before the monitor in his room finished crackling. He reached the boys' chamber before the night guard. Before the housekeeper on call. Before anyone. He sat on the edge of Cassiel's bed in the dark and did not turn the lights on. Did not speak, couldn't. Did not reach for the boy immediately but instead placed one hand flat on the mattress, visible, steady, and waited. Cassiel's screaming wound down into hiccuping, shaky breathing. Then the boy crawled across the sheets and collapsed against Oren's side. The night guard arrived at the doorway, saw them, and backed out without a word. On the security monitor 2 floors up, the timestamp read 2:14 a.m. In the surveillance room, Caleb Draxler sat alone in the dark watching the feed. He watched Oren hold his son in the black and white footage, steady and unhurried, for 47 minutes. He did not move from his chair. He had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in 14 months. Not since the event. Not since the version of Cassiel who used to run laughing through these corridors disappeared and was replaced by this small, furious, terrified person who attacked everything that came near him. The palace doctors had theories. The specialists had treatment plans. The therapists had frameworks and vocabulary and intake forms. None of them had sat in the dark and waited. Kayla watched the monitor. Then he picked up his phone and called Broderick Vance at 3 a.m. "Tell me about him," he said. Not a request. Vance cleared his throat. He had been awake. He was always awake. Orrin Calloway, 26. Former communications student. Lost his voice 3 years ago following a traumatic laryngeal injury. He communicates through writing and basic sign language. No family listed. No permanent address prior to this month. His previous employment references all describe him as exceptional with. Tell me something the file doesn't have. A pause. He brought a children's book from home, Vance said quietly. His own copy. Worn through at the spine. He's been reading it to Cassiel in the evenings. Just turning the pages and pointing at the pictures. Cassiel follows every page. Kayla said nothing for a moment. He's effective. He is. Keep him. He hung up. On the monitor, Cassiel had finally fallen asleep against Orrin's arm. Orrin sat completely still so he wouldn't wake him. He was still sitting there when the sun came up. The security system logged everything, including the moment, just before dawn, when Orrin looked directly at the camera in the corner of the room. Like he knew someone was watching. Like he didn't mind. The next afternoon, Broderick Vance found a note slipped under his office door. The handwriting was neat and careful, the letters shaped by someone who had once been trained in precision communication. It read, "When did Cassiel stop eating breakfast?" Vance stared at the note for a long time. Because that was a question the medical reports had never once thought to ask. And 3 hours later, after Orrin had spent the morning sitting with Cassiel not over a proper palace dining table but cross-legged on the playroom floor, eating plain buttered toast from paper napkins like they were camping, Cassiel ate. For the first time in 14 months, he finished a full meal. The kitchen staff heard about it within minutes. By evening the entire palace knew. That night the head of security, a man named Deshaun Mercer who had worked for Kayla Draxler for 7 years and prided himself on missing nothing, pulled up the archived footage from the ballroom cameras. He went further back than day one. He went to the archived footage from 14 months ago. The footage from the event. He found the file. Opened it. And the file was empty. Every frame from that date. Gone. The message came through Broderick Vance on a Tuesday afternoon, slipped into Orrin's hand on a small card with no greeting, no explanation, just a time, 7 p.m., and the words, "The West Study. Come alone." No name. He didn't need one. Orrin stood outside the West Study at 6:58 p.m. in the cleanest clothes he'd brought, which was not saying much. His second-hand button-down had a small bleach spot near the cuff he'd done his best to hide by keeping that arm slightly turned. His notebook was in his left hand. Pen clipped to the cover. He had learned in his years of silence to carry both everywhere, the way other people carried their voices. Ready. He knocked. One knock. The door opened immediately, like the man behind it had been standing exactly at the threshold. Kayla Draxler was taller in person than the surveillance angle suggested. That was the first thing Orrin registered. The second was the exhaustion the man wore underneath a precision-fitted dark suit. Eyes that had not fully rested in a long time, a tension across the jaw that did not loosen when Orrin walked in, a stillness that was not calm but rather something held extremely tight. The study was not what Orrin expected. He had pictured a room built to intimidate. Mahogany desk like a judge's bench. trophies. Framed evidence of power. Instead, the room was almost sparse. One large desk clean. One bookshelf stacked not with decorative volumes but with the actual broken spine kind that had been opened many times. Two chairs near the window, plain. A single framed photograph on the shelf, too far away to see clearly. Kayla did not sit behind the desk. He sat in one of the window chairs and gestured at the other. Oren sat. They looked at each other for a moment. Then Kayla said, with no preamble, no performance of authority, no build-up, "How is he sleeping?" Oren opened his notebook. Wrote 4 words. Turned it around. Better. Not fully yet. Kayla read it. Nodded once. Does he cry in the night? Oren wrote, sometimes. Less than before. Does he ask for me? Oren stopped writing. That question landed differently than the others. Not because it was inappropriate. Because of how it was asked. Not with entitlement. Not with the assumption of a man who expected the answer he wanted. With something much quieter underneath it. He wrote carefully. He reaches for the doorway sometimes. Like he's expecting someone. Kayla was quiet. Then, he used to come find me. Every morning. He said it plainly, without performance. Before. Oren did not write anything. He waited. He doesn't come anymore, Kayla said. Not asking for a response. Just saying it the way a person says something they've been carrying in a room alone for a long time. The fireplace across the room made a small sound. Outside, the palace grounds were going dark. Oren looked at the man in front of him. This person that 3 city tabloids had described as the most dangerous alpha in the region, that rival syndicates reportedly refused to meet face to face, that his own staff navigated carefully like a room with furniture you weren't allowed to touch, and what he saw was a father who had been standing outside his child's door for 14 months, not knowing how to walk through it. He wrote slowly. Turned the notebook around. He's not afraid of you. He's afraid of everything. There's a difference. Kayla read it twice. He didn't respond right away. He picked up his glass from the side table. Water, not liquor, Oren noticed, turned it once in his hand. Then he looked up. What do you need? He asked. For Cassiel. Whatever it is. Oren wrote a short list. 6 items. Simple things. Consistent schedule. Same foods. Same spaces. Lower lighting in the evening. Fewer unfamiliar faces rotating through the corridors near the boys' room. And one more thing at the bottom, underlined. Time. More of yours. Kayla stared at that last line the longest. He didn't argue it. Didn't deflect. Just absorbed it with the focused attention of a man who had spent his entire life processing threats and had not expected this conversation to qualify. All right, he said quietly. Oren closed his notebook. He stood to leave. He was almost at the door when Kayla spoke again, without looking up from the glass still in his hand. You didn't eat dinner. Oren turned. Broderick tracks the staff meals, Kayla said. Flat. Matter of fact. You've been skipping the evening meal. Every day this week. Oren stood there. He hadn't known anyone was tracking that. That stops, Kayla said. Still not a request. He didn't look up. Oren walked out of the west study into the corridor and stood very still for a moment in the quiet. He pressed his back against the wall and looked up at the ceiling. Something had just happened in that room that he did not have a name for yet. He walked back toward Cassiel's wing. He did not sleep well that night. Not because of the boy. Because somewhere around 3 in the morning, his brain finally produced the thing it had been working toward all evening, the detail that had been sitting just outside his attention during the entire meeting. The single framed photograph on the bookshelf in the west study. He had been too far away to see it clearly. But he had been close enough to see that the person in the photograph, small, soft-faced, dark curly hair, looked almost familiar in a way he couldn't place. Not like someone he knew. Like someone he should remember. And at that exact moment, on the other side of the palace wall, the first alarm of the perimeter security system began to sound. The first explosion hit the east gate at 11:47 p.m. Not a full detonation. A shaped charge. Precision work. The kind of thing designed not to level a wall but to punch a hole through it exactly wide enough for 3 men to move through fast. Deshaun Mercer had the palace in full lockdown within 40 seconds. 40 seconds. He would spend months afterward insisting that was fast. That 40 seconds was an exceptional response time for a compound this size. His team would agree. The external security consultants brought in later would agree. It still nearly wasn't enough. Oren heard the alarm and was moving before his mind caught up to his feet. He crossed the corridor from his room to Cassiel's in 6 steps, pushed the door open, and found the boy already awake, sitting straight up in bed, eyes wide and locked on the window, body rigid with the specific stillness of an animal that has learned the difference between a loud noise and a dangerous one. Cassiel knew the difference. This was the dangerous kind. Oren crossed the room in 3 strides, sat down on the bed directly in front of him, and put both hands gently on the boy's shoulders. Not gripping. Just present. He waited until Cassiel's eyes found his face. Then he nodded once. Slow. Deliberate. I'm here. I see you. We're okay. Cassiel grabbed his sleeve. Both hands. Small fingers wound into the fabric of Oren's shirt and held with a strength that didn't match his size. The second alarm hit, interior perimeter, second ring. And the overhead lights cut to the low red backup system. Cassiel made a sound low in his throat. Oren pulled him close and tucked the boy's face against his chest, one hand covering his ear on the exposed side, and began doing the only thing he could do, rocking. Slow and even. The rhythm he had already learned. Cassiel responded to. 3 armed security members swept the room within 2 minutes, checked the windows, confirmed the room clear, and positioned themselves outside the door. Deshaun Mercer's voice came through the hallway radio. Package secure. All wings accounted for. East breach contained. Do not move civilian personnel. Through the wall, Oren could hear the movement of men. Heavy boots. Rapid commands. The organized chaos of a team that had trained for exactly this. And then a different sound. Footsteps he recognized without seeing them. Not because he had heard them often. Because they had a specific weight to them, deliberate, controlled, that registered differently than everyone else's. The door to Cassiel's room opened. Caleb Draxler walked in. He was in a dark tactical vest over what looked like clothing he'd thrown on quickly. His jaw was set hard. His eyes swept the room in under 2 seconds, windows, corners, guard positions, and then landed on the bed. On his son. On Oren holding his son. He crossed the room and crouched down at the bedside so he was eye level with Cassiel's covered face. Cass, he said. Just that. The man's entire voice changed shape on that one syllable. Cassiel didn't pull away from Oren. But one small hand reached out sideways and found his father's hand in the red-lit dark. Kayla closed his fingers around it. The 3 of them stayed like that for nearly a full minute, while Mercer's voice kept coming in through the radio outside and the palace grounds worked through the contained breach, and everything that mattered happened in this small red-lit room instead. Eventually Cassiel's grip on Oren's shirt loosened. His breathing slowed. He did not fall asleep, not yet. But the rigid terror in his small body gave way to something that was simply tired. Kayla straightened up slowly. His face had gone carefully blank again in the way it always went when something had cracked it open and he was closing it back. He looked at Oren. He didn't say anything. But Oren had become good, in his years of silence, at reading what people meant when they didn't speak. What Kayla meant was, "Thank you." And underneath that, something he almost certainly had not planned to let anyone see tonight. "I don't know what I'd have done if he hadn't been okay." Mercer knocked once and opened the door. "Sir? We need you." Kayla stepped back. Straightened. The blank face completed itself. "Stay here," he said to Oren. Not unkind. Just absolute. He walked out. The door clicked shut. Oren sat in the red light with Cassiel leaning against him and listened to the palace settle back around them, the alarms quieting one by one, the heavy footsteps moving further away, the compound returning to something that resembled calm. He looked down at the boy in his arms. Cassiel was staring at nothing. Processing. The way children process things they don't have language for yet. Internally. Privately. In whatever space a 4-year-old reserves for the things that are too big for outside. Oren stroked once, slow, across the top of his head. Cassiel closed his eyes. And from somewhere down the hall, muffled through 2 closed doors and a stretch of corridor, Oren heard 2 staff members talking in low voices. Not arguing. Just that particular kind of exhausted talking people do after a close thing. He only caught fragments. Lost his mother before the event. The boy never. Kayla doesn't speak about it. Not once. Not to anyone. I heard she didn't just pass. I heard she was. The voices moved away. Gone. Oren held very still. Because what had just reached him through the wall of a locked-down palace, in fragments he wasn't supposed to hear, rearranged something he thought he understood. Cassiel had not just lost safety 14 months ago. He had lost someone before that. Oren looked down at the boy asleep against his chest. He thought about a 4-year-old carrying 2 losses at once. He thought about what it looks like when a person stops trusting the world to hold them. He thought about ceramic vases and screaming and 32 caregivers who had left. And then his mind snagged on something else entirely. A detail so small he almost missed it. Cassiel's hand, in the dark, had reached for his father. Which meant the boy hadn't stopped trusting Kayla. He was waiting to see if Kayla would reach back. Oren needed to think. He also needed to look at that photograph in the West study again. The one that looked almost like someone he should remember. He found the records by accident. That was the thing about the Draxler Palace. It was enormous enough that staff had learned to carve out small routines to orient themselves. Broderick Vance took the same route through the East Corridor every morning at 6. The kitchen team rotated their prep stations on a fixed weekly schedule. The groundskeeping crew mapped their work in overlapping zones so that someone was always visible somewhere. Oren had developed his own route. Early mornings, before Cassiel woke, he walked the long gallery that connected the residential wing to the administrative quarter. Not to explore, just to move. To have space where his thoughts could breathe. He'd been doing it for a week. On the 8th morning, he took a wrong turn. A door he had assumed was a closet. Plain, unmarked, slightly recessed into the wall, was unlocked. Inside was a small records room. Shelves of folders. Filing cabinets. A single desk, dusty enough to indicate it wasn't used regularly. And along the left wall, a set of archived incident binders organized by year with handwritten labels. He should have walked out. He almost did. But the second binder from the left had a label that stopped him cold. Cassiel, Medical and Incident, Month 1 to 8. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he stepped in. He didn't take the binder. Didn't remove anything. Just opened it carefully on the shelf and read, standing, in the gray early light that came through the single frosted window. The first 15 pages were standard medical forms. Birth records. Early developmental notes. Vaccination records. The boy had been healthy. Thriving even. The notes from the first 3 years painted a picture of an ordinary child. Active, vocal, with a particular fondness for building things and a tendency to follow his caregiver of the time, a man named Tobias Wren, everywhere. Tobias Wren. The name appeared frequently. Then on page 19 the notes shifted. Date stamp, 14 months ago. The medical entry was brief, clinical, stripped of detail in the way documents get when someone wants the information on record but not the story. But enough survived. Patient admitted. Presenting with acute anxiety response, physical hypervigilance, selective nudism, and disrupted attachment behaviors. Recent history of prolonged separation from primary caregivers. No physical injury reported. Psychological impact classified as significant. Recommended ongoing therapeutic intervention. Caregiver Wren, status unavailable. Oren read the last line twice. Status unavailable. Not transferred. Not resigned. Not retired. Unavailable. He turned the page. The next entry was a week later. Same clinical format. Cassiel had stopped eating. Stopped sleeping through the night. Had become physically aggressive with staff who entered his space without warning. The attending physician recommended a calm, consistent environment with minimal staff rotation. 14 months later. 32 caregivers. Nobody had managed consistent. Oren kept reading. The therapist's notes, 3 pages, carefully typed, described what they called a disrupted trust architecture. The child had experienced an event during which people he relied on had been unable to protect him, and in response, his nervous system had concluded that proximity to other people was itself the danger. He wasn't attacking caregivers out of cruelty. He was trying to make them leave before they could hurt him first. Oren stood very still. He thought about Cassiel handing him building blocks one at a time. About the boy reaching into the dark for his father's hand. About the way, on the very first day, Cassiel had run across an entire ballroom towards someone he had never met, something he had done for no one else in 14 months. Why? What had he seen? Oren closed the binder carefully. Replaced it exactly as he found it. He walked back out into the corridor, and stood in the cool morning air thinking about what it means when a wounded person chooses someone. Not randomly. Not by accident. With everything that's left of them. He began moving toward the gallery. He was halfway down the corridor when Deshaun Mercer fell into step beside him without warning, which was impressive given the man's size. "You went into the records room," Mercer said. Not a question. Oren held up his notebook. Wrote without stopping walking. Door was unlocked. "It's always locked." He wrote, "It wasn't this morning." Mercer looked at him sideways. "Nothing in those files will tell you what actually happened." Oren stopped walking. He looked at the security chief. Mercer's face was exactly neutral. The kind of neutral that professional men wear when they are choosing what not to say. Oren wrote, "Where are the security logs from that day?" Mercer was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. "There are no logs," he said. Oren wrote, "Because they were lost?" Another pause. "Because they were deleted." Oren stood in the corridor with the morning light moving across the floor between them. He wrote one more thing. Turned the notebook so Mercer could read it. "Who deleted them?" Deshaun Mercer looked at the question. Then he looked down the corridor in the direction of the administrative quarter, past 3 locked doors and a guarded checkpoint, toward the section of the palace where the server rooms were housed. He didn't answer. He walked away. And Oren stood alone in the gallery with the question still hanging in the air between the marble walls. Someone inside this palace had erased the only record of what happened to Cassiel. Not an outsider. Not a rival syndicate. Not a security breach. Someone who had access to the internal systems. Someone who was still here. Kayla Draxler learned sign language in secret. Nobody knew. Not Broderick Vance. Not Deshaun Mercer. Not the 12-member security team that tracked his every movement for professional reasons. Not the palace staff who had worked under him for years and believed they had mapped every corner of the man. Oren found out by accident. It was a Wednesday evening, 11 days after the Eastgate breach. Cassiel had fallen asleep early, the good kind of early, the kind that comes after a full meal and an hour of building towers and knocking them down and laughing about it. Oren had settled him in, pulled the blanket up, and walked out into the corridor with the quiet particular satisfaction of a day that had gone right. He turned the corner toward the gallery. And stopped. Kayla was standing alone at the far end of the corridor, facing the window, holding his phone. On the screen, Oren could see it from 10 feet away because the palace corridor was very quiet and very still, was a sign language tutorial. A hand demonstrating a single gesture. Over and over. Kayla repeated it. Got it slightly wrong. Watched the screen again. Tried once more. He didn't hear Oren approach. He didn't notice him standing there for the 3 seconds it took Oren to understand what he was seeing. Then Kayla looked up. The phone went dark immediately. His expression completed itself back to neutral in under a second. The particular blank wall expression he used when something had caught him unprepared. Oren looked at him. Then he raised one hand and made the sign Kayla had just been practicing. Hello? Kayla was very still for a moment. Then, slowly, imperfect, a little stiff, but unmistakably intentional, he signed it back. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no music in the corridor. No chandelier light chosen for the occasion. Just 2 people standing in a palace hallway at 8 in the evening, one of whom had been learning a language in private for reasons he had not told anyone. Oren opened his notebook. He wrote, "How long?" Kayla looked at the question. Then at the window. Then back. 10 days, he said. 10 days. Since just after the breach. Since the night in the red-lit room when his son had reached for both of them in the dark and Kayla had apparently gone home to his study afterward and started a tutorial from the beginning. Oren wrote, "Why didn't you tell me?" Kayla said nothing for a moment. Then, "I wanted to be able to talk to him myself. Not through someone else." A pause. "Not always through you." That was honest. Remarkably honest for a man who spent most of his communication budget on silence and authority. Oren wrote, "That's good. That's very good." They stood in the corridor. "Show me the one for good morning," Kayla said. Oren showed him. Kayla repeated it. Slightly better this time. They spent 40 minutes in that corridor. Not sitting. Not making a ceremony of it. Just standing near the window while the palace settled into its night rhythms around them, and Oren showed him gesture after gesture, slowly, clearly, letting Kayla's hands find the shapes at their own pace. Kayla was not a fast learner at this. That matters. Because the man was clearly someone who excelled at most things. The precision of how he moved through the palace, the economy of his speech, the way he processed information in meetings. All of it read as a person who had built himself into someone who did not require practice. Who absorbed competence as a default setting. He was bad at this. His hands were too controlled, too precise, which actually worked against the natural looseness that sign language required. Oren kept showing him. Without impatience. Without commentary. And when Kayla got a gesture right for the first time, the sign for safe, one hand over the other, Oren held up one finger and nodded once. Yes. That one. Something shifted in Kayla's expression. Brief. Small. But there. 3 days later, at breakfast, Cassiel between them at the low table, Oren had moved from the formal dining room to the playroom at Kayla's eventual agreement. Kayla leaned down and signed something to his son. clumsy, a little slow. But Cassio watched his father's hands and understood. The boy looked up at Kayla with an expression that had no easy name. Then he pressed his small palm flat against his father's hand and held it there. Broderick Vance, passing the doorway on his morning round, stopped walking. He stood in the corridor for a full minute before quietly moving on. That night, Oren was in his room writing in the small journal he kept, not notes about Cassio, just his own thoughts, the ones he had nowhere else to put, when a knock came at his door. He opened it. No one was there. But on the floor outside his room sat a small tray. Evening tea. His specific preference, he hadn't told anyone his preference, had simply chosen the same thing from the staff kitchen 3 nights running, and beside the cup, a small card. One line, in handwriting he recognized as Kayla's. Cassio called you home today. He signed it wrong, but I understood what he meant. Oren stood in the doorway for a long time. He picked up the tray. He went back inside. And somewhere down the east corridor, behind a door that looked exactly like every other door in that wing but was used exclusively for security monitoring, a camera that had been positioned to cover the residential hallway recorded the moment Oren Calloway pressed the small card against his chest and closed his eyes. The system logged the timestamp. It logged everything, including the second camera, the one mounted in the corner of the monitoring room itself. The one that was supposed to be inactive. The one that had been recording internally for 6 weeks, feeding to an external server that nobody on Deshaun Mercer's team had found yet. The footage surfaced on a Thursday. It came through Mercer's office at 7:14 in the morning, a single encrypted file delivered to the palace's internal security server from an anonymous source inside the system. No sender identification. No cover message. Just a file, time-stamped, with a label that read, Archive, Event Recovery, 14 months. Mercer opened it alone. He watched 41 seconds of footage. Then he called Kayla. By 7:45 a.m. the 3 of them, Kayla, Mercer, and Oren, who had been pulled from the breakfast table with no explanation, were standing in the small security room off the administrative corridor, watching a monitor. The footage was grainy. Old. External camera, not palace grade. It showed a parking structure. 3 levels visible. Timestamp in the corner reading 14 months and 6 days ago, 2 weeks before the palace incident Mercer had listed in his reports as the beginning of everything. A vehicle was parked on the 2nd level. A black SUV, back door open. And beside the SUV, on the concrete ground, sat a small boy. Cassio. Younger. Smaller. But unmistakably him. He wasn't screaming. He was very still in the way that Oren now understood meant the terror had moved past a certain point and the body had gone quiet to manage it. 2 men stood near the vehicle, backs to the camera, talking. Then a third person appeared at the edge of the frame. Oren recognized himself before his brain finished the sentence. He was heavier in the footage. His face younger by 3 years. He was carrying grocery bags, the same worn coat, even, that he still owned. And he had clearly walked into this parking structure from the street entrance, and stopped dead when he saw the child on the ground. The footage had no audio. But the sequence was clear. Oren in the footage set his bags down. Walked toward Cassio slowly. Hands out. Low posture. The exact same body language he had used on day 1 in the palace ballroom. The 2 men turned. What followed was 30 seconds of footage that Oren could not fully process in real time because he had no memory of it. Not a gap, a complete absence. The 3 years surrounding his accident had soft edges in places. His doctors had attributed it to the trauma of the injury and the surgery that followed. He watched himself in grainy black and white place his body between a 4-year-old child and 2 adult men. He watched himself take a hit. He watched himself stay standing anyway. He watched one of the men grab him by the coat, and he watched himself, this version of himself he had no access to, hold on to Cassiel's wrist with the other hand and not let go. Then the parking structure's overhead lighting failed. The footage went dark. When the emergency lighting restored, 12 seconds later the two men were gone. The vehicle was gone. Oren was on the ground. Cassiel was sitting beside him. One small hand on Oren's arm. The footage ended. Nobody in the security room spoke for a full 30 seconds. Then Mercer said quietly, "We traced the vehicle plates 6 weeks after the event. Both men were employed by the Resin Syndicate at the time. They've since moved operations across state lines." He paused. "We didn't know there was a witness. The parking structure cameras were wiped. This footage came from a private security camera on the building across the street. Someone recovered it. Who sent it?" Kayla's voice was completely flat. "We don't know yet." Kayla turned and looked at Oren. Really looked. The way he had looked at him exactly once before, that first day through the doorway of the ballroom, with something underneath the controlled expression that couldn't be entirely contained. Oren stood very still. His hands were shaking slightly. He pressed them flat against his sides. He didn't remember any of it. Not the parking structure. Not the men. Not the child. Not the hit he'd taken or the 12 seconds of darkness. 3 years ago he had walked into a parking structure with grocery bags and walked out, apparently, having done something he hadn't told a single person about, and then promptly lost access to inside his own memory. And Cassiel, 4 years old, nonverbal with trauma, unable to explain to anyone why he trusted this one specific person, had been carrying it the whole time. Not in his memory. In his body. Oren thought about the first day. The ballroom. The ceramic vase 2 inches from his face, and the child running across the room. The child hadn't chosen a stranger. He had recognized safety. He had remembered the one person who had stayed. Kayla crossed the room. He stood directly in front of Oren, close, which was unusual, because Kayla Draxler maintained distance from people the way most people maintain punctuality. Deliberately. Consistently. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You protected my son." His voice did something on the last 2 words that Oren had never heard it do before. Oren lifted his hands. He signed, slow and careful, the sign Kayla had learned 11 days ago in the corridor. Safe. Kayla's jaw moved. Then Mercer's radio crackled. "Sir?" The voice on the other end was one of the gate team. Controlled, professional, but underneath it, tight. "We've got a problem at the south entrance." Kayla turned. "What kind?" A pause. "The Resin Syndicate. They're outside the perimeter. 6 vehicles. Armed." Another pause. "And sir, they're asking for the caregiver by name." The room went very still. Oren looked at Kayla. Kayla was already moving toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back. "You do not leave this building," he said. "You do not go near a window. You go to Cassiel and you stay with him." His eyes held Oren's for 1 second longer than necessary. "Do you understand me?" Oren nodded. Kayla walked out. And the door swung shut behind him with a sound that felt, in the silence that followed, a great deal like the closing of something that could not be undone. The south entrance held for 11 minutes. Then the convoy moved. Not through the gate. Mercer's team had reinforced that in the weeks following the East breach, and the Resin Syndicate knew it. They moved around, splitting into 3 groups. 2 vehicles peeling north toward the maintenance access road. 1 vehicle, a single black truck, accelerating hard toward the service entrance on the building's west side, which had been assessed as secondary threat level and staffed accordingly. It was not staffed accordingly anymore. Oren heard the impact from inside Cassiel's wing. The sound wasn't an explosion. It was heavier than that. A collision, structural, the kind of sound a building makes when something hits it with enough speed and intention to mean something. Cassio looked up from the blocks. Oren was already moving. He crossed the room, lifted the boy, and moved to the far interior wall, away from windows, away from the door, back corner, exactly what Mercer had walked him through 2 weeks ago during the mandatory security briefing that Oren had paid extremely close attention to. He pressed his back to the wall, Cassio against his chest. The boy was very still. Processing. His breathing was controlled in the way that meant he was frightened past the point of reaction. Footsteps in the corridor. Fast. Too fast for Mercer's team, who moved with purpose but not panic. The door handle turned. Oren pulled Cassio tighter. The door opened and one of Mercer's secondary guards appeared, young, breathing hard, earpiece crackling, and said, "We're moving you. Now. Emergency protocol. Come with me." Oren didn't move. He looked at the guard. Something was wrong. He couldn't name it immediately. It was the kind of wrong that doesn't come with a label, just a physical sensation, a specific reading of the room that his body produced before his mind caught up. The guard's earpiece was crackling. But no one was speaking through it. Oren shook his head. "Sir, I need you to." He shook his head again. Harder. The guard's expression shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. Then the door behind the guard opened wider and 2 men in plain clothes pushed through. Not Mercer's team. Not anyone Oren had ever seen in this palace. Everything happened in the next 8 seconds, and afterward Oren could only account for some of it. He turned into the wall with Cassio completely shielded behind his own body. He was larger than most people expected him to be. That had always been true. The chubby Omega label people attached to him did not account for the fact that he was also broad and solid and had spent 3 years carrying grocery loads and warehouse stock and a grief that had weight to it. He took the first grab on his shoulder rather than Cassio. He took the second one on his side, hard enough that his vision went briefly white at the edges. He did not let go of the boy. Cassio made one sound. High and sharp and terrible. And then the window across the room blew inward. Not from outside, from a rope access team on the exterior wall, Mercer's actual team, entering through the second-floor window with the kind of coordinated speed that indicated they had been tracking this room's status and had moved the moment the door feed showed the wrong faces. 12 seconds. The room changed completely in 12 seconds. The 2 men in plain clothes were on the floor. The false guard was restrained in the corridor. Mercer himself came through the door 30 seconds later at a controlled run, assessed the room in one sweep, and looked at Oren pressed against the wall still holding Cassio. "You didn't go with him," Mercer said. Oren shook his head. "Good instinct." A pause. "Very good instinct." He pressed his earpiece. "Package secure. Send the..." He stopped. His expression changed. "Say that again." A long pause. Mercer's face went completely still in a way Oren had not seen on the man before. He looked up. "Kalis down," he said. "South gate." He took a hit intercepting the truck. Another pause, listening. "He's breathing. He's being transported." The room was very quiet. Cassio, still pressed against Oren's chest, made a sound that was not a word but carried every weight a word could carry. Oren closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then he opened them. He shifted Cassio to his hip and looked at Mercer. He wrote one word in the notebook, fast, and turned it. "Hospital." Mercer looked at it. "You'll be escorted," he said. He said it like a yes. In the vehicle 20 minutes later, moving through city streets with a security detail front and rear, Cassio sat in Oren's lap and pressed his small face against Oren's collarbone. He didn't make a sound. But his hands, both of them, were gripping Oren's shirt the same way they had the first night. Like letting go wasn't an option. Like something in him understood that the people who stayed were not guaranteed. Oren held him. Outside, the city passed in streetlight and glass. Inside the hospital, somewhere past the emergency doors, Kayla Draxler was in surgery. And on the second floor of the Draxler Palace, in a monitoring room that Mercer's team had just located after 6 weeks of scanning, the rogue camera feed that had been transmitting internally finally revealed its target server address. Mercer's tech team traced it in 11 minutes. The address led to an office inside the palace's own administrative wing. A name was attached to that office. Someone who had been employed there for 3 years. Someone who had attended every staff briefing. Someone who knew exactly which entrance was staffed as secondary. Mercer looked at the name. He called his most trusted officer. "Find him," he said. "Don't let him leave the building." Kaler opened his eyes at 4:22 in the morning. The room was dim. Hospital dim, the particular gray-white of a space that never fully goes dark. Monitors beside the bed. 4-line. The faint mechanical rhythm of something tracking his pulse with steady indifference. He turned his head. Oren was in the chair beside the bed. Not asleep. Just there. Elbows on his knees, head bent slightly, present in the specific way of someone who has decided they are not leaving and has made their peace with the discomfort of that. Cassiel was asleep against his side, curled into the narrow chair space, one small hand still holding the front of Oren's shirt even in sleep. Kayla watched them for a moment. He didn't speak yet. There was something about the room, the stillness of it, the specific quality of 4 a.m. in a hospital where everything non-urgent has gone quiet, that made it feel removed from the larger world. Like a pocket cut out of time. Then Oren looked up. Their eyes met. No performance in it. No management of expression. Just two people on opposite sides of something that had been very close. Kayla said quietly, careful not to wake Cassiel. "You're still here." Oren held up one hand. Signed yes. A pause. "You should sleep." Oren shook his head once. Kayla looked at the ceiling. The monitors tracked his pulse with their indifferent rhythm. His side was heavily bandaged. 2 fractured ribs, a laceration that had required surgery, and what the attending physician had described as a fortunate trajectory, meaning the alternative was something nobody was going to say out loud. He had known the risk when he moved toward that truck. He had moved anyway. He said, "I kept thinking." He stopped. Tried again. "When Mercer called me and said you were in that room with those men." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Oren reached into his notebook. Wrote something carefully. Leaned forward and set it on the bed within Kayla's reach, not wanting to disturb Cassiel. Kayla looked down at it. "We're both still here. That's what matters right now." He read it twice. Then he did something Oren had seen exactly once before, briefly, in a dimly lit ballroom. His expression lost the careful architecture of control he kept over it, and underneath was just the man. Tired. Grateful. Afraid of something he hadn't fully named yet. "I'm not," Kayla said. He paused. Chose his words like they had weight. "I'm not good at this part." Oren tilted his head slightly. "Needing people," Kayla said. "Letting them matter." "A beat. I've been running an operation since I was 22 years old that requires me to function like needing someone is a structural weakness. I built a whole system on that." He looked at Oren. "And then my son ran across a ballroom toward a stranger, and I stood there and watched, and something in the system stopped making sense." Oren was very still. He picked up his notebook. He wrote slowly. Deliberately. Then turned it. "You've been reaching back the whole time. You just didn't know that's what it was called." Kayla read it. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he reached out, very slowly, and placed one hand over Oren's where it rested on the bedside. Not dramatic. Not performed. Just a choice, made at 4 a.m. in a hospital room, by a man who had spent 14 months afraid of what he'd lose if he let anyone close enough to leave. Cassiel stirred. Blinked. Looked up at his father with the cloudy eyes of someone coming back from deep sleep. Kayla signed to him, slowly, imperfectly, the words he'd been practicing in the corridor. I see you. I'm here. The boy looked at his father's hands. Then he climbed across the gap between the chair and the hospital bed and pressed himself carefully against Kayla's uninjured side. Kayla closed his arm around him. He looked at Oren over the boy's head. That look lasted 3 seconds. It said everything that 14 months of silence, and closed doors and carefully managed distance had been building toward. Mercer arrived at 6 a.m. He knocked once, waited, then entered. He looked at the three of them. Kayla sitting up in the hospital bed with Cassiel asleep against him and Oren still in the chair, closer now, their hands no longer touching but not far, and his expression did something complicated. Then he put his professional face back on and said, "We have the traitor." The room shifted. Kayla straightened. "Who?" Mercer said the name. Broderick Vance. The name landed in the room like something physical. Oren's notebook slid off his knee and hit the floor. He didn't pick it up. Because Broderick Vance had been the one who called him personally. Who had told him about the bleeding caregivers. Who had slipped Oren's note about Cassiel's breakfast under his own door and responded to it with resources. Who had stood in that doorway with wet eyes watching Cassiel hold on to Oren on the first day. Who had access to every system in that palace for 11 years. Why? Kayla said. Flat. Cold. The man behind the empire, fully present now. Mercer said. Resson Syndicate was paying him for information. Cassiel's schedule. Security rotations. Staff changes. A pause. He was the one who arranged for Tobias Wren to be removed from the palace before the event 14 months ago. He created the opening. Silence. He also deleted the parking structure footage the first time. Mercer added. The copy that surfaced this week came from an anonymous source. We believe it was Wren himself. He's been trying to surface the truth for months. Kayla said nothing. Cassiel slept through all of it, cheek against his father's shoulder. Oren picked his notebook up from the floor. He thought about Broderick Vance, and the way the man had looked at Cassiel with wet eyes on the first day. He thought about performance. About how long a person can maintain it. About how sometimes the most dangerous version of someone is the one who has practiced being trusted. He wrote one line in his notebook and did not show it to anyone. I should have seen it. He crossed it out. Then he wrote underneath it, I'll see it now. The gala was Kayla's idea. Not a gala in the commercial sense, not a charity event or an industry showcase or any of the other performances the Draxler name had been attached to over the years. This was a private gathering. 40 people. The senior members of the city's financial and political structures who needed to understand that the Draxler empire was not diminished, not fractured, not weakened by what the Resson Syndicate had attempted. And something else. Something Kayla had decided in a hospital room at 4 a.m. With a monitor tracking his pulse and 2 people he was no longer willing to keep at a careful institutional distance. He was going to introduce Oren. Not as staff. Not as Cassiel's caregiver. Not with a title that allowed the room to file him away in a comfortable place. He was going to introduce him as exactly what he was. Oren found out about this 2 days before the event when Kayla told him directly, without ceremony, sitting at the low breakfast table in the playroom where Cassiel was arranging wooden animals into a complicated order that apparently only he understood. Kayla said, There are things I want to say publicly. About you. About what you've done for this family. I won't do it without your agreement. Oren looked at him for a moment. He picked up his notebook. What exactly are you planning to say? Kayla told him. Oren was quiet for a long time after that. He watched Cassiel move a carved elephant to the front of his arrangement and study it critically. Then he wrote, "Okay." One word. Kayla nodded once. He signed to Cassiel across the table, slowly, the way he always signed now, with the particular patience of someone learning a language because he refused to stop, the sign for good. Cassiel looked up from his animals. He signed back. Not good. Home. Kayla's hands stayed still in the air for a moment. Then he pressed his palm to the table and breathed. The night of the gala was cold. The palace had been prepared, the grand ballroom open, the chandeliers at full light, the marble floors polished to the degree that the light reflected back up from every surface. 40 guests moved through the space with the particular careful energy of people in a room where the stakes are understood but not stated. Oren stood near the east entrance in the best clothes Broderick. No. Not Broderick. In the best clothes that Mercer's assistant had sourced for him without being asked. Dark jacket. Clean. Fitted correctly for once, which was a new experience. He stood holding a glass of water he wasn't drinking and watching the room with the attention of someone who has spent 3 years processing the world through observation rather than speech. Cassiel was beside him. The boy had insisted. He was in a small suit that matched his father's in color. Oren had not orchestrated this, had not even known about it, and when he saw it his chest did something complicated, and he stood next to Oren's leg with both hands loosely at his sides, watching the adults in the room with the same careful measuring attention that Oren used. Like father. Like chosen person. Like child. Kaler entered the room at 8 p.m. The shift in the room's energy when he entered was immediate and unmistakable. Not fearful, exactly, though that element was present, carried in the body language of several guests who adjusted their positions, but attentive. The way a room responds to someone it has organized itself around for years. He moved through the space with a word here, a handshake there. Working the room in the way powerful men work rooms, efficiently, without waste, the social math done in real time. Then he crossed to where Oren and Cassiel were standing. He didn't stop beside them briefly the way you stop beside staff. He stopped. Full stop. Turned toward them. Gave them the same attention he had given the city councilman he'd spoken with for 5 minutes near the entrance. The room noticed. Rooms always notice. He crouched down to Cassiel's level. Signed something, a short phrase still imperfect, getting smoother every week. Cassiel signed back, quick and easy, then leaned against his father's knee for a moment before standing straight again. Kayla stood. He looked at Oren. "Ready?" he said quietly. Oren nodded. Kayla turned to the room. He didn't raise his voice significantly. He didn't need to. A room full of people who have been tracking his movements all evening quiets on its own when he begins to speak. "Most of you," he said, "know this family by its reputation. By its history. By the names that have been in your newspapers over the last 14 months. He paused. You know about the attacks. The breach. The internal compromise that Deshaun Mercer and his team resolved last week. The room was completely quiet. What you don't know, Kayla continued, is what actually held this family together during all of it. He looked at Oren. And the room followed his gaze. This is Oren Calloway, Kayla said. 3 years ago, before he knew this family, before he knew this palace, before he knew any of what you see in this room. He put himself between my son and 2 armed men in a parking structure and did not let go. Nobody moved. He came to this palace when everyone else had given up. When 32 people had decided Cassiel was not worth the effort of staying. His voice was steady. Careful. Every word placed. He stayed. Without being asked to. Without being offered more than the original salary. He stayed because that's who he is. Oren was holding very still. Cassiel had moved during the last 30 seconds. Nobody had seen him do it. He was small and quiet and the room was focused on Kaler. But the boy had crossed the small distance between himself and Oren and put his hand in Oren's and was now standing that way, looking up at his father, completely calm. Kayla looked down at his son. Something crossed his face. Something large and unmanaged and completely public. He looked up at Oren. "He's not staff," Kayla said. The room heard it. Every person in it. "He's not an employee. He's not a temporary position or a contractual arrangement." A pause. "He is family. He is my partner. He is the man my son calls home." Cassiel turned to Oren. He reached up with both arms. Oren lifted him without hesitation, the automatic movement of someone who has done this so many times it has become muscle memory, and held him. Cassiel pressed his face against Oren's neck. And then, for the first time in 14 months, in front of 40 witnesses and crystal chandeliers and the marble floor that had once held the wreckage of a ceramic vase, Cassiel Draxler said a word out loud. Small. Rough at the edges from long disuse. But completely clear. "Papa." The room did not applaud. It didn't need to. What happened in that room was not a performance. It was recognition. The feared Alpha King crossed to them and placed one hand on Oren's shoulder and stood there. With his son and his partner, and didn't say anything else because there was nothing else required. Mercer, at the edge of the room, looked at the floor for a moment. Then up. Then he started clapping. Slowly. One person joined. Then another. Then the room. Later, much later, after the guests had gone and Cassiel had been carried to bed already asleep, Oren stood on the east terrace in the cold night air with his hands on the railing and looked at the city. Kayla came and stood beside him. They stood in silence for a while. Then Kayla reached over and signed, slowly, one-handed, the careful imperfect sign language of a man still learning, the word he had practiced most. "Stay." Oren looked at him. He signed back immediately. No hesitation. Yes. Below them, the city spread out in light. Inside, Cassiel slept in a room where both doors were unlocked and both people he needed most were within reach. And on the terrace, in the cold dark, Kayla reached out and took Oren's hand. Not dramatically. Not with ceremony. The way you hold something you nearly lost and are not planning to let go of again. The palace was quiet. For the first time in 14 months, fully, completely, genuinely quiet. Then Mercer appeared at the terrace door. He held a small envelope. White. Sealed. No return address. "Delivered to the East Gate an hour ago," he said. "Hand-delivered. The courier was gone before our team could detain him." He held it out to Oren. Oren's name was on the front. Not his current name. His birth name. The one he had stopped using 3 years ago after the accident. The name that existed in no current documentation. The name that only a person with access to records from before would know to use. Oren looked at the envelope. He looked at Kayla. Kayla's jaw had set. Mercer said quietly, "We don't know who sent it." Oren took the envelope. He opened it. Inside was a single photograph. Black and white. Old. A hospital room. A man in a hospital bed, and beside the bed, a much younger Oren, maybe 17, holding the man's hand. A man Oren had believed, had been told, with documentation, with a death certificate he had signed, had been dead for 9 years. He stared at the photograph. His hands were shaking. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting he recognized from somewhere deep in his memory, somewhere he had not accessed in almost a decade, 3 words. "I found you." The city lights burned below. The night held still. And somewhere beyond the palace gates, moving through the dark streets of a city that had no idea what was coming, someone who knew Oren Calloway's real name was already close. If this story moved you, if you've ever felt invisible until the right person finally saw you, drop a comment and share what moment hit you hardest. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if you want to be here when the next chapter of Oren's story drops, Subscribe right now and turn on notifications. Every story on this channel is built to remind you that chosen family is real, that love finds its way through the hardest walls, and that the people who stay are the ones worth holding onto. Don't miss what's coming next.